Hey guys, welcome back. We are so glad to have you here.
193.
Oh, Kevin Thompson was just checking his how many reviews on Amazon his books have versus mine. Good to have you here, though, guys. How do you feel, Kev? Ready to go?
We have not started.
Oh, this is totally the start of it.
No. Let's start over.
No. Oh, they're nodding. Yes, yeah. They're going. Okay, here we go. So really good to have you here at the Bible study. He doesn't want this to be in the beginning, but by friends, partners, and lovers, and we'll get those Amazon reviews up.
Way up.
Guys, really good to have you here. We are doing Romans chapter 11, one of the great crazy passages of the Bible, but we're only assigned to do like the first maybe 11, 12, 13 verses of Romans chapter 11. So we're going to jump into this. We are in Romans 9 to 11 is this crazy passage where Paul is asking this question that probably it's not something Kevin Thompson woke up this morning going, I wonder about the Jews being saved, though, in light of Christianity being a thing. Like, it's not something that we tend to wake up in the morning going, this is the thing that's bothering me, which is kind of a great principle in and of itself around how Bible study actually works. Like, let's just start there. Sometimes the Bible's not about you.
Sometimes
it's about God and salvation history. And so when you're reading Leviticus and you're bored, like, let's just admit that sometimes happens. I'm raising 3 daughters and trying to raise them in the ways of Jesus. And one of the honest conversations sometimes is, Dad, we're like, how's your Bible study? So we did this thing. I was telling you about this the other day. So we started this week where my wife had heard it on a podcast, so I thought it was brilliant. So a little parenting tip for you. Not that I want to take away from your parenting tips because you have many more than me. But this great little thing where it's like Sunday night, sit down with our kids, each individually for 20 minutes and ask them big questions about their life. What are you going through? What are you dealing with? What are you excited about? What are you nervous about? What are you stressed about? How's your time with God? What can we pray for? And then we pray for them right there. And one of the things that, we're digging into like our 11-year-old, and it's like the Bible, how's your time with God? And it's like, she's like embarrassed, like, I don't know what the Bible, it's kind of boring, Dad. It's like, whatever. It's like, yes, sometimes it can be, because sometimes it's actually not about you immediately. Like, you got to wait a couple steps. You got to have patience with the Bible, because sometimes it's asking massive questions that we don't wake up thinking about on the daily and go, I don't know, I don't have any money in my bank account and my marriage is struggling. Romans 11, not about that. It's not. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, and I think it's the concept of, I try to have conversations with my children sometimes, and they are bored out of their minds.
Right.
And they don't realize that what I'm talking about is important.
Yes.
But I'm not talking about their issue, and so they want to ignore that.
Yes.
All right, if that gap exists between me and my kids, how much greater is the gap between God and us?
Yes.
And so we have to trust that He knows what He's talking about.
Yes.
Great so when the discipline of Bible study brings us to this place, when the discipline of preaching through a book brings us to this place, we have to submit ourselves to Him and say, okay, God, you know more than we do.
Right.
You're going to show us
I don't know why
something.
we did 10 chapters on the size of the curtains in the tabernacle, but okay, I guess it's important.
Yeah, and the same thing here with Romans 11. But we also have to admit and watch. So for me, Romans 11 tends to be a throw-off chapter.
Yeah.
Much more interested in 8.
Yes.
I'll spend an eternity in 12. 11 doesn't matter. But Ochtemeyer is going to say 11 is the climax of the book. Others are going to say in the argument of what's going on to the church at Rome and what was taking place, this is the question they were actually asking.
Yes.
And so because of our shared humanity, we can get back into that,
Yes.
figure out what the original context had to say, what the issue was, and then from that glean, I think, some very important lessons for us that can walk away
Great
from
little
this.
segue. Let me start at chapter 10, verse 21, because I think that's kind of where it lands, and then I'm going to speak to exactly what you just said. He goes through this kind of Old Testament history right from 9, and he goes through the Israel story. He starts with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, then this, then that, then the prophets, or the Exodus story. Then he comes through the prophets in chapter 10, and he goes through all these things, and he says, but of Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient, contrary people. So he kind of ends that, and then, we all got to remember, white out your chapters. There's no chapters, no Bible verses back then. He's got this argument going, and he gets to this point where he's like, okay, I ask then, has God rejected His people? And to your point, what has arisen, what has kind of created this question is exactly the scenario that's happening in the Roman church, but also just across that whole region, where what Israel was, the Jews were the people of God. They had the law, they had the Torah, they had circumcision, they had food laws, they had Sabbath, they did all these things. And then Christianity comes about. Gentiles have started to believe in Jesus. Probably it started to gain traction among the Gentiles. Now you've got this church full of Jews and Gentiles. Paul's trying to say, don't worry, we're all equal, because even though Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, the fact that he's come in the climax of salvation history, now the Gentiles can join, everyone's equal. And it's caused the Gentiles to go, okay, I think we're the better people because we came later. And it's caused the Jews to go, I don't know whether I'm going to believe in this Jesus guy, because how does he let all these dirty Gentiles in? I thought it was supposed to be this way. And so this has created this question for Paul to go, okay, wait a minute. If there's seemingly more Gentiles believing in Jesus than there are Jews, does this mean that God has rejected his people? So to your point, that's kind of exactly what they're asking, because they're sitting in Rome going, where are the Jews that have believed in Jesus? It seems to be all these like Americans, Canadians, and like all these non-Jews. Yeah. And so this is the question that gets raised by the historical situation. Any comment on that?
And the concept of, if God has forsaken the Jews, then what trust do we have? Mm-hmm. So maybe he'll just forsake us later as well.
Exactly.
And so that's how it gets into that question. So whenever it goes into verse number 1, I asked then, and I think that then, so I'm NIV, right? So I think the then is important, because what's he talking about? Where does that go back to? It appears that it goes all the way back to 9:30. What then shall we say in chapter 9, verse 30? Yeah. And then he makes this argument about Israel's unbelief. And so I asked then, in response to what I just talked about, 9:30 all the way through to chapter 10, did God reject his people? By no means. And he proves that in part by saying, I am an Israelite myself.
Yes. So
and that has
why,
multiple meanings, right?
So just, and then I'll let you, so by no means is the answer. For I myself am an Israelite. Go.
Yes. So several things come to mind there. One, he is an Israelite, so he's passionate about this. Yeah. It's not that Paul himself is rejecting the nation of Israel, but then also he's an Israelite. Yeah. Well, if he's a believer, then God hasn't rejected the whole nation, because he's still believing in this very moment. So Paul uses his own life now as an example of what's taking place.
Yeah, that's right. So I Paul, grew up, I'm a Shamite Pharisee. You know, if you read most of the scholars on who Paul was, his history, his life, you know, you can read a few biographies. N.T. Wright's got a great one. He's got a great book called What St. Paul Really Said, but also a biography on Paul. And obviously James Dunn, a bunch of people have written these great books on Paul. And what they talk about is his context. Shamite Pharisees were pretty, you know, we read in Acts chapter 8 that he oversaw the first killing of the first Christian, Stephen. They laid their cloaks at the feet of a man named Saul, who was Paul. A Shamite Pharisee was a Pharisee who was pretty jacked up about the holiness of Israel, that if Israel could get themselves pure, the kingdom would come, God's will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. They were working toward that. And Paul was one of these guys where you brought about peace with a knife. Like you did some violence in order to keep Israel pure. That he was a pretty jacked up guy. A scholar, had memorized most of the Old Testament probably. You know, we hear about this, the way they did rabbi school back in the day. By the time you're 12, 13 years old, you had Genesis to, you know, Deuteronomy, memory, you know, all of these kind of crazy things that we can't even think of.
You have memorized Garth Brooks' discography.
Yes.
He had memorized the New Testament.
He had memorized the New Testament. That's for all the Arkansas boys. And so, yes, that's true. So you have this guy, and he and people say, you know, that even if the New Testament even if 13 letters hadn't been written, but even if Christianity, Paul might have been a guy we talked about, like a Plato, like a Socrates, like a Josephus. He was so schooled and brilliant that he, as a writer, as a thinker, he was unbelievable. And so to your point, he's saying, man, no one's more Jewish than me, right? Look at what he says. I'm an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Of course, in Philippians 3, he gives a bigger list, circumcised on the 8th day, in regard to righteousness, more righteous than anybody. And like you said, I have become a Christian. I mean, he wouldn't even put it that way. And that's the great, I mean, that's the whole discussion. How do we even talk about this? This is a guy going, I've realized that this is, you know, according, you know, chapter 10, verse 4. Great verse in regard to the argument of Romans. For Christ, meaning the Messiah, is the end of the law. That word end is the Greek word telos. It's like, it's not just the end, it's like the point or the climax of the law. Christ is where this story has been going all along, And now we as Jews can do one of two things. We can either believe in him, or we can separate from the road of what his argument is, the true covenant people of God. If you don't believe in him, Jew or Gentile, you are refusing being the covenant people of God. But he is the climax of the story. So if we disbelieve in him as Jews, man, we're giving up our own story.
Yeah.
That's kind of where it goes. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And so then he goes into verse number 2. God did not reject his people. He says now emphatically.
Yes.
He's answering this question.
Yes.
God did not reject his people, whom he foreknew. Don't you know what Scripture says? And then he tells the story about Elijah. And so you go back to, is it 1 Kings or 2 Kings?
Yeah, 1 Kings 19.
1 Kings 19,
yeah.
where the story of Elijah now, if he feels like all of his people have been rejected by God, he's pleading to God, why am I even still alive? Why don't you just go ahead and take my life? And God supplies him food and basically says, I'm going to show up, I'm going to visit you. And that's when he comes in the fire and the earthquake and the wind. God's not in any of those things.
Yeah, it's great.
He shows up in the whisper.
So good.
A great preaching story.
Right? I read it just before because I wanted to go back to what is in Paul's, what's the story in his mind when he writes this. So I went back and read it, and it's just so beautiful because, like you said, the earthquake happens. I'm not in the wind. I'm not in the earthquake. I'm not in the fire. And then he's in the whisper, and it's like, oh man, sometimes that's the God we serve. Yeah.
Well, and just the application of that in this moment.
Yeah.
All right. So we are reading this passage that's a little bit foreign to us.
Yeah.
But even that story speaks to us at this moment.
Yeah.
We think if God's going to show up, we're looking for him, especially Americans.
Yeah.
We expect God in power.
Right.
That God in power is going to force everything to take place. Isn't that the exact same thing that the original readers of the New Testament were looking for? The Pharisees and the Sadducees, one of the reasons they missed Jesus is because they look for God in power, and yet he so often rejects the power and then comes to the softness of the whisper. That's
really good. 1 Corinthians 1 says that the Greeks look for knowledge, but the Jews look for power. So it's interesting that you know that's kind of what when's God going to show up in power?
Yeah.
Which is legitimate because they're waiting for the Spirit to come, which is what everybody had said. When the moment of salvation comes, it's going to come in power. It's going to look like this, and so they have that in their brain. But anyway,
and instead he comes in humble relationship.
Yeah.
So it's almost like
it's like marriage. It reminds me of this book I wrote. Friends, lovers, and partners.
You can't even get the title right.
I got
the God of Problem.
Yeah. Go with it. Don't worry. People hack that title all the time. It's always
So Elijah is now this example, but why is that story included here? It could be just simply included here that Elijah is an example of this question. He feels like God has rejected all the people, and God comes in and the message he sends to Elijah is, no, I've saved a remnant.
Yeah.
And now we have this great pattern of God all throughout Scripture of this idea of the remnant. And that's where the text is.
So before we get there, there's this word he says, so God has not rejected his people. Obviously, his people, if you got a pen and you're kind of, going through all this, his people, Israel, that's what he's this people that he chose back in the time of Abraham to take care of the problem of Adam. Remember that Adam creates the sin in chapter 3 of Genesis. In Genesis 12, God chooses Abraham to reverse the Adam problem. Through you, I'm going to deal with the problem of sin. I'm not going to tell you how that's going to play out, but I'll tell you it has to do with you having a whole bunch of offspring. And through them, I'm going to deal with the problem of sin in the world, which is this weird kind of, it's become so normal to us I love just going back going, wait a minute, how is this a good plan? Like, okay, so you've got sin as a problem in Genesis 3. Genesis 12, your plan's to call an old man and he's going to have a whole bunch of kids. That's the plan. Like, why don't you just deal with it?
Yeah.
And yet he does this weird thing all through history that becomes this, I'm going to choose this people, and through this people there's so many layers of brilliance in what God's doing, but I don't think it's how you and I would deal with it.
No.
I don't think that's the plan we'd come up with.
No, there's no way.
Yeah.
But there is this bigger picture that's going on in which God is saying, this is the path for my glory to really be explained in the best way, and for you to be recipients of my love. That without this, there's aspects of me you're not going to know. There's aspects of the story that you're not going to understand.
He's such a patient. He's a 3 mile an hour God, as my old systematic theology professor used to say.
That's good.
It's like you want him to hurry up.
Yeah.
And he takes so long to do everything. And you're like, let's go.
But that idea he is doing.
But I think as Christians, modern Christians living in the Western world, we have to be reminded of this, that even in our gospel presentations, and I'm not saying this is easy. As an evangelist, I tend to go here too. So I'm not being critical of you, I'm being critical of myself. We tend to go, here's the powerful story. You're created in God's image, you sinned, and now give your life to Jesus because he died on a cross and he rose again for your, I mean, that's what we tend to jump to as the gospel.
Yeah.
And in that presentation, we miss thousands of years of history of this middle part of the story that we forget, which is Israel. He called this people group that, in fact, I would argue Jesus doesn't even make sense without.
Yeah.
There's why 12 disciples? It's not because 12 is a good number and it's one less than 13 and one more than 11, because there's 12 tribes of Israel. Why does he come through the waters of the Red Sea and go out into the wilderness for 40 days? Because Israel went out for 40 years. Everything about him is Israel imagery, and yet we just jump to like, we don't know what to do with all that. It's like Jesus wasn't a white Canadian. He wasn't, he's not, we make him in our image.
Yeah.
We take all these cultures and we go, look at Jesus, he's a this and he's a that. No, he wasn't. He was a first century Jew for a reason, right? Yeah.
So, well, and that concept of, I mean, that's what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
That's what every single person that's listening, the two of us, no doubt, is we take Jesus, conform him into our likeness, and then try to promote him to other people and say, you should be like me, and you should be like my God. And, and this is the power of what Scripture does, is it calls us out of ourselves and into the historical story that actually took place, and say either worship this guy or you're going.
And it's challenging.
Oh,
it's okay. Okay, so very good. So you want to talk about this word foreknew? You said earlier off camera that you knew exactly what this means. I'm just kidding.
Well, so it takes.
So what do you want to do with foreknew here?
Yeah, well,
he foreknew these people.
Our coworkers would ignore it, but you and I will deal with it. And so it takes us back to Romans chapter 8, and you have what's called the golden chain here in Romans 8, in which God foreknew, he also predestined.
What verses are we on?
So 8:29.
Yeah.
So foreknew, predestined to be conformed into the image of his Son.
Yeah.
And so he said, those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he justified, and those he justified, he also glorified. So you have this pattern here that when Paul says these that he foreknew, that means in the end he's going to glorify them. But it's a pattern and it's a process that gets there. And what Paul, I think, is saying in this moment whenever he says that he foreknew them is he's saying God has not given up on them, which means God hasn't given up on you. Which is a tremendous application point, I think, for all of us to remember, is because there are times in which it feels like God's given up on us. And we can justify it in 1,000 ways. He should have given up on us long ago. But this idea that God has not done so, that he knew us from the very foundation of the earth, he knows you now.
It's good. It's really good. I'll add a second piece to that. The fact that he foreknew, it means that he planned it. He already knew this was going to happen. And what's beautiful about that is it's all part of his plan, meaning, and this is where I think we forget sometimes, it's far more comforting to me to be worshiping a God, or at least biblical and then comforting, to worship a God who actually knows what's happening before it happens. So what's happened recently in different streams of theology, open theology, whatever, where they've tried to say, if we say that God foreknew, then that means he knew evil was going to happen, and we're not really comfortable with him knowing, so let's just put him in a state where he doesn't know stuff, and he's learning along with us. So this is a kind of a progressive stream of theology. So God is self-limited himself and said, I don't want to know anything. So Hitler was born, he's like, oh, I'm going to watch this a little bit and see what happens. Like, this is what we've done in order to save God from this word.
Make him less powerful, less knowledgeable, so he's more loving.
Yes. Yeah. And so I love, you can read Donald Blesh on this, trying to kind of recapture our imagination, God the Almighty, in these different books where it's like, God is he's so powerful. Don't try to limit him down to our level of he's just learning along with us. And he's like, oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. Okay, guys, here we go. It's like, what are we doing? Why do we think that's I don't see that as a good solution to it's like, oh, great. Now I worship a God who has no clue what's happening.
You end up
that is not what you get in the Bible.
You end up with a weak God who can do nothing.
He can do nothing.
So what's the point?
What's the point? It's just us. And now it's almost back to Babel. We're just building, we're making him in our image. We're walking up to be like him, which is, so anyway, he did foreknow. He foreknows all things. He's omniscient. He knows all things. He's, all the way back from the beginning of time, he knew everything that was going to happen.
Give me the
and
power
yes,
of
that creates all kinds of tensions, but it's just true.
Give me the encouragement of that. So for the person who's listening, who generally this word foreknow, they don't like, they're uncomfortable, and I get the negative ramifications of it, no doubt, and we understand that as well.
Yeah.
There's a positive ramification of this.
Yeah.
What is the positive aspect of this verse?
Life and history is not chaotic.
Yeah.
Things are not, as the one writer I always read, Darrell Johnson, but the book of Revelation, chapter 1, things are not as they seem. When you look around the world, and it looks chaotic, and it looks like Jesus is losing, and it looks like the nations are in peril, and life has no order, life has no purpose, life has no climax, life has no anything. Actually, when you pull back the veil, you see that there's a scroll, and the Lamb is holding the scroll. And John weeps. Who can hold the scroll? And the scroll is, Revelation 5. Who can hold this scroll? And the scroll is history. It's the way your life is unfolding. And John's weeping because no one will hold it. And then the Lamb breaks forth, and it's like, okay, someone's in control here. That's the encouragement I see. What do you think?
And just within the concept of, for me, this kind of conversation almost always happens in the context of either extreme persecution or extreme loss, in which I feel like God's given up on me. And so whenever salvation is about me and me choosing God, what happens if I'm not strong enough?
Yes, right.
But when salvation is about God and his divine mercy toward me, no matter what I feel in the moment, no matter what I'm going through, God has not given up on us. God knew from the get-go, he knows now.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so we solved foreknowledge. Great. Do you not know that the scripture says of Elijah, to your point, 1 Kings 19, go read it, how he appeals to God against Israel. Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. And he's quoting this passage where all this stuff Kevin talked about earlier. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed a knee to Baal. So Baal was this god that this ancient people worshipped, and the Israelites, in the midst of kind of the silence of God or their disappointment with God, they had started to worship Baal and go, I'm gonna actually worship him. And God was obviously upset. And so it's like, why? So I wanted to kind of just leap for a minute or two into, we could look back at those old Israelites and go, how dare you worship Baal? And I had the picture of, Elijah's up there. He's like, send the fire down. All that stuff. But we worship idols. Right?
We make fun of the Israelites because they worshiping Baal, and then we sacrifice our entire Christian lives for a political party or for a sports team.
Or money or power or sex or whatever it is.
And the nation of Israel would look at us and go, at least we sold ourselves for something of value.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you're doing it for
At least
nothing.
It was spiritual.
Yes.
Yeah, so we all worshiping idols, of course, is a big topic today. It's become very popular over the last 20, 30 years, but it's always been. I mean, Martin Luther's commentary on the Ten Commandments is one of the most famous kind of exegesis of idols, because he says, the first commandment is, don't have any other gods before me. And he says, every time you break any of the other 9, you're always breaking that one first. And the great example of that is, I think about this often. I, as a pastor, if you walk up to me and you say, I sent you that note, Pastor. Oh, yes, I totally know about that note, and I'm going to get back to you. And I'm lying. In that moment, why am I doing that? And at the end of the day, what's happening is that being someone of integrity, it's being overshadowed by my desire to look good. So in that moment, I'm not worshiping God above all things because I don't want to look like I'm a bad pastor, so I lie, and my ego's taking over. So we do this all the time. Every time we worship a nice, shiny new car or more money or more power or more sex or whatever it is in the wrong context, we're feeding what Calvin called the idol factory of our soul. It's just constantly filling itself with more idols. And God obviously is against people who are idol worshipers, either physical, like I worship the statue, or suburban middle class idols like we worship. Anything to talk about idolatry?
I can't top the idol factories of our own hearts.
Right.
You got me there. Okay. You lost me at idol factories of our own hearts.
All right. So they obviously, all these guys had, Elijah's point is, man, I guess you've given up on Israel. Same question that they're asking. And the citation is, no, I kept 7,000. This word Paul raised remnant. And the fact that there's a remnant, the fact that I've kept, there's 7,000, and notice I have kept, right? They didn't even keep themselves, actually. I mean, that's the crazy part.
Yeah.
I kept them.
I reserved.
Come on, who deserves the credit for your salvation? You? No, I kept these 7,000 guys from destroying themselves. That's how good I am.
The NIV is, I have reserved for myself.
There you go. All right, so I love that. So he keeps these 7,000, and the point Paul is saying, so let's unpack this a bit, is the fact that those 7,000 exist means he loves and has not, to the question of verse 1, he has not rejected his people. The fact that there's even one left means he has not rejected. There is a Jew who believes in the Messiah. He starts with himself, and then however other many remnant are, and that means God has not rejected his people.
Well, and that concept of remnant, I think, is a key theological concept.
Yes.
And I think it's also a great deal of encouragement to us today that even if things are as bad as we think they are, and sometimes I don't think they are,
right.
But
in the culture war conversation,
yes,
maybe.
No, that's
even
exactly
just like,
right.
We're losing, we're all losing.
Well, then keep on believing.
Right.
Because it is the pattern of God to keep a remnant in the midst of all things. But notice, as you're the remnant in the moment, the remnant cannot become, so look at how great I am. Look at how holy I am. Everybody else needs to look like me. No, it is a remnant chosen by grace.
Yes.
Which means even in that moment, we are
Verse
still,
5,
we're even amazed by our own belief.
Yes.
Because we recognize it as a gift from God, that without him, I wouldn't even have that.
Yeah.
And so we're allowed to remain faithful and trustworthy in the midst of all things, to give to our opponents a love they don't give to us, to hold back a judgment that they might return to us, to not engage with an anger or a vitriol that the culture war kind of calls for, but instead to have love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control, to live that life as a remnant of God's people, knowing that remnant will never end, but instead God will build on it to advance his kingdom.
It's good. And to another point there, thought about this as you were saying that. When he gets really down and thinks, let me give a dark narrative about how bad things are, God goes, well, I kept 7,000. Things aren't, like you said, things aren't as bad as they seem. So let's bring that into, here's what we forget sometimes. In the midst of all of our narrative about how bad we're all losing, how bad Christianity is losing, it's the fastest growing religion still in the world, bar none. I mean, we're talking about, you have to be pretty ethnocentric and thinking only about, America and Canada to be discouraged sometimes about the growth of Christianity. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America right now, Christianity is growing faster than it has ever grown in the history of time.
That's good.
Right? 3,000 people a day come to Christ in Latin America. In Asia, it's the fastest growing thing in the world. Go ahead.
So go back to that Elijah story. So Elijah says, so they've killed all these prophets, they killed all your people. I am the only one left.
I'm the only one left.
I'm the only one left. So even there, he makes it all about himself. Yes. And God comes in and he doesn't say, yes, but at least you're still here.
Right.
He goes, no. What about those 7,000?
Right. There's 7,000, bro.
No, that's exactly. And so we can very easily, as Westerners, begin to think we're the only ones left.
Right.
And the church in Africa is laughing hysterically as they send missionaries to us.
Yes.
The church is exploding.
Or Korea, all over the Asian world. Christianity, Jesus is winning, guys, and be encouraged. The church is growing. The gates of hell will not prevail against us. And that momentum narrative, even though sometimes it's a harder narrative to preach or whatever it is, it's true. The Holy Spirit is doing unbelievable things all around the world. And we sometimes get a bit down on ourselves and think we're losing because we're only focused on ourselves.
And so let's think about that. I mean, we're filming this in California, right? And so where it feels like to some that this is a state of darkness and that, I'm moving here, and people are like, why are you moving to California? How dare you do that to your family? Right. But this idea, even...
So what do you mean by, as a Canadian, what do you mean by that? You were moving from Arkansas, a more conservative state, you're coming to a more progressive one, and that's what they meant?
Yeah, the idea that it's much more unchurched.
Right. Whereas my story coming from Vancouver was the opposite. Everyone would say, are you sure you want to move down there because it's so churchy? Like, do you want to move down to California because there's just so many Christians and it's so churchy, which isn't really your jam?
Yeah.
Like, let's stay in Vancouver and do the progressive thing. So it's funny. It's just
that
the
is
different
funny.
way.
Yes.
Yeah. So
we
anyways,
both got criticized.
Yeah.
But that concept of, okay, how do we be a remnant in California?
Yes.
How,
That's great.
how are you a remnant in Vancouver?
Right.
What does that look like? What is the mental approach to that? Because the approach that some have is, all right, then I got to fight like hell, right, to save people in this moment. And they go with this cultural war mentality, and that's what their social media is about. And their persona is angry and it's frustrated and it's fighting, and it really is, I am against you.
Yes.
Whereas this is a remnant chosen by grace.
It's good.
Saved by God himself with a way that is contrary to this world.
Yes.
And so how do we fight in a different way? How are we a remnant in a different way?
Yeah, that's really good. Salt and light, not seen as the antagonist to win something. But even from Romans chapter 8, where he talked about we are losing all day, we're dying all day. He's quoting some Old Testament passage to say that we're like Jesus. And it kind of says to me, like, I'm not sure if we're set up in a certain context that we're supposed to be winning all these wars that we want to win. If that, like Jesus talks about, you're in the world but not of it. So if we're in the world but not of the world, maybe we're not supposed to be winning because the world's rules and are so corrupt that how could we win them?
No.
It's like running a race and everyone's on drugs, but we want to be people of character. Of course we're not going to win. Yeah. Because we held on to our character. And Jesus going, but from an eternal perspective, you're going to win. But from the eyes of this world, bro, it's underground church, it's persecuted. I never promised you anything different than that. Yeah.
So that's exactly right. And it could be that we're fighting something we've never been called to fight.
Yeah.
But instead we're called to live and bring joy and peace in the midst of all the chaos that is around. And to show a certain aspect of the stability that love brings into a life. So as there is chaos all around us, that it's almost like the eye of the storm of the hurricane, right? That we have this peace about us and this stability about us that only Jesus can bring, that cause other people to look at us and go, there's something weird about them.
Yes.
And it'll drive some away, but it'll drive some too.
Yeah, it's really good. Okay, so verse 6, but if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. It's kind of what we've been talking about. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. And then he gives this, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, meaning, I think he means kind of Jew and Gentile together, but the rest were hardened as it is written. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear down to this very day, which is a very fascinating quote. It's one of the most quoted passages in the whole New Testament from Isaiah. And it's also the one Jesus quotes when he's telling parables. And here's what because they're like, well, none of your listeners are understanding any of these stories you're telling. You're talking about birds eating seeds. No one knows what you're talking about. And I love Jesus in this moment. Bonhoeffer said, sometimes it's the job of theology to retain the mystery. Sometimes Jesus doesn't explain things. He just tells a parable, and everyone's like, what does that mean? And he's like, you know what? Sometimes I tell stories, and some eyes are going to see, and some ears are going to hear, and some won't. That's why I told it. And he walks away. It's like, wait, what? What's going on? Like, there is something very interesting that God does when he, we're always trying to convince everybody of stuff all the time, and there's something, a security in, you know what? I'm going to do my best to present the gospel as it is, to present God as who he is, not pander to you, to make him palatable, and you can deal with the tension. Deal with how it rocks you. That's part of the point. If it doesn't rock you, I don't think you're hearing it right. No. And that's the power of it, right? Yeah. So,
and an aspect of evangelism. If evangelism was up to us, then I would try to find my niche target and go after them with all that I can.
Yes.
But if evangelism, if people coming to Christ is ultimately up to him, then I can, like the parable of the sower, spread seed wherever and watch. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I never expected it to grow there.
Right.
I never expected God to call you.
Right.
I never expected.
Yes.
And then there is this joy and excitement in seeing what God is doing in our lives, which we would never have if all on us.
It's good. Okay. Any last comments on this passage? We're out of time.
I love Romans 12.
Okay. Yeah. Would you like to jump there for 10 minutes? The YouTube comments want us to go longer and longer. So you want to? What do you want to do?
Well, I do think that there is a closing concept here of how does this passage cause you to love Jesus more? What is it about this that causes you? So we began with the idea of we have very little understanding or attachment to this passage.
Yeah,
We've gone through it. We've seen some action points. How does this story draw you to Jesus more?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of a deep point I want to make here, but I think it's super important, or by deep, I mean a little hidden. So the answer to that question for me is 11 and 12. So I ask, did they, meaning Jews, stumble in order that they might fall, meaning like forever? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, their unbelief, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Here's the beautiful part. Israel is going through a cruciform pattern themselves. Jesus was the one who had been, by the Father, excommunicated. Like, he suffered. He suffered isolation. He fell and then rose again in this pattern that now he's saying it's almost in reverse. Israel's going through it. They're falling. They're trespassing. They're not believing. But man, when they do believe, it's going to be like a resurrection from the dead. How great will their full inclusion be? This is crazy because they've spent this time almost playing out the same pattern as Jesus, their Messiah, themselves. And so he says, man, there's this rising and falling pattern to even their story that I, as a Jew, I'm looking at, I'm going, man, how great is it can be when these guys rise from the dead and actually believe in this Messiah. So that's what makes me love Jesus more, in the sense of, man, he didn't come and just give a bunch of parables and ascend into heaven. He suffered, he died, he wrote, like, all of that is what makes me go, man, look at what Jesus has done for me. Let's live it out in the midst of the tension. Yeah.
And I mean, I would jump on that, and just with the idea of the end of God's story is going to be so much greater than what we can see at this moment. That's good. Yeah. And so we might be writing this chapter today. Yeah. God's writing chapters later. Yeah. And we can't even begin to imagine what he's going to do, which should, in this moment, give us an awe and worship of God, fill us with joy, and empower our obedience in the midst of this day, knowing God will make something of it we can never fathom.
Great. All right. Great final word, guys. Thank you for joining Kevin and I for the Bible study here at Bayside. Make sure that you subscribe, that you comment positive things, that you share this Bible study with lots of people. We love digging into the Bible verse by verse. It's what we do here. And here we are in chapter 11. And we're going to do, I think, one or two more of these, and then jump into some other marriage stuff and whatever for the fall, and then come back to chapter 12 in a couple months. So, guys, thank you for joining us here on the Bible study. God bless you guys, and have a great week. We will see you next time.